Well, today marks the end of this series that we've been in all summer long. We've been looking at this list of virtues that the Apostle Paul gave to the church at Galatia in this letter called Galatians. And when I look at this list, and I think probably you also, when you look at this list, there's a couple of things that I notice. The first thing that I notice is that this is a very desirable list of virtues. I mean, we look at this, and I think all of us want to be this type of person. We want to be a person of love and joy and peace. We want to be kind people. We want to be patient people. We want to be people that are gentle and faithful. Like, this is what we desire. I think you could take the roughest, toughest, rough tumble person in our prison system, and inherently, they really do want to be this type of person. But the other thing that I notice is that it seems like a pretty lofty goal. Because sometimes the things that we have going on, maybe things that, like, we watched our father do this, or we watched somebody else do this, or the media, or whatever it is, it kind of pushes us to a place where we're not so loving, where we're not so joyful, where we're not so peaceful. So we want this, we want these virtues, but oftentimes we think, man, that is a difficult list. But the Apostle Paul promised us that those who have been bought by the blood of Christ, who are empowered by the Spirit of God, have access to these virtues. They don't have to just give in to the works of the flesh that he talked about earlier. They have access, and it is attainable for them to live by, and even expected of them to live by these virtues. And this is what Paul says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, where we're wrapping things up today. Against such thing there is no law. And, the against such things there is no law, that's a phrase that we really haven't talked about any in this series. But what Paul is saying there is, Paul, he came from a Hebrew Jewish background, who he knew the law really, really well, and he knew that many of the people he was writing to knew the law really, really well. And so what he was saying there is like, man, there is no law of humanity, there is no law of Israel, there is no law or no set of rules that are going to disagree with this. Like, everybody agrees that this is what we should attain to, is this one singular fruit that manifests itself in these 9 different flavors. And so Paul finishes the list with self-control. And when I look at the list, self-control, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it almost seems like it doesn't quite fit. It almost seems like it's not, like it's a little different than the rest of the list. And I want to talk about that in a minute, but I think if we're honest, we would rather skip this one. I think if we're honest, we don't want to talk about self-control because we can be the most loving, kind, joyful person, but still struggle with self-control, can't we? Like, we all have moments where self-control is something like we wish we had a little bit more of it in this moment. For some people, maybe that is at the buffet line, or I've confessed this to you all before, but when the rolls come out at Texas Roadhouse, I lose all self-control. I have none. I just can't stop. And then I always ask the waiter to bring me more that I'm secretly going to stuff into a bag, and then I'm going to ask for more that I'm secretly going to stuff into a bag, and by the time we go home, we take 16 extra rolls with us, and I eat them the first night. It's just how we do it. We could use some self-control. Maybe for you, food is not a thing, but maybe for you would like more self-control when it comes to being at the mall. Or maybe, to be more relevant today, in the Amazon app. Or maybe it's about what you watch on a screen, or the amount of time that you spend on a screen. I think we all have these moments where we would just look and say, I wish I had just a little bit more self-control to not do the things that I am wanting to do. Well, luckily, Paul says that self-control, it can actually be ours. I want to work through this morning the first chapter of Daniel, because I think that it does a really good job of showing self-control in 3 main places that we probably need self-control, or at least three places that I need self-control, and I'm just hoping I hit somebody out there also. Daniel chapter 1 starts out like this. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So in 605 BC, the Babylonians, they took control of Jerusalem, they took control of God's people, and they took them captive. And one of the things that they did is a lot of the things that were important to the Israelites that were in the tabernacle, like in their worship house, they took those and they brought them and they put them in the treasury of their worship house, the Babylonian worship house. And in a way, what they were doing is they were mocking God by taking Yahweh's treasury items and putting them into Babylon's treasury items. But I think one of the things that you see here, one of the micro themes that will come back up over and over again throughout the book of Daniel is that Nebuchadnezzar is very selfish. And he wants to use people selfishly for his gain. We see this on more than one occasion. He wanted to get the best looking, the most skillful, the most intelligent, the men who came from places of royalty, the men who came from places of nobility, and he wants to train them up in his language, and he wants to do all of this so that he can use them in his service. So in other words, he's saying, go out and find the best of the best. Go out and find the ones that you think that they're going to make my life easier and that they're going to make me more prosperous and they're going to make me look better. And so once he gets these young men, he plans to teach them this new language, this new literature. It's the literature of the Chaldeans. It was what he was. Like, these are his gods. These are his customs. These are his guidelines. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, he wants to indoctrinate them to be something different than what they are. And I would bet that some of you right now are sitting there, that word indoctrinate, that did something to you. I would bet some of you are thinking, well, that's what the progressive liberals are trying to do, or that's what the conservatives are trying to do. They're all just trying to indoctrinate us. Let me do you one better. That's what the devil is trying to do. And let me tell you, he's succeeding. He's doing a pretty good job of it. See, these young men, they were raised with a very specific set of doctrines, a very specific set of beliefs, and a code that did not match up with the doctrines and belief and the code that Nebuchadnezzar had handcrafted for them. And if you are a Christ follower, you kind of fall into that same camp. You've been given a particular set of doctrine, a particular set of beliefs, a particular worldview that puts Jesus of Nazareth at the center of who we should follow, who we should look, and it puts this overarching theme of redemption in our minds. And like, that's what we're going after. But Satan is and always has been a master manipulator. He has always been the father of lies, and he is constantly planning and indoctrinating us with ideas and things that are contrary to that worldview. I mean, think about politicians. Politicians on both sides of the row and in between are legislating things that are contrary to the Christian worldview. Through music and art, he's injecting ideas that are contrary to that Christian worldview. Through media outlets, he uses well-spoken, well-written, very intelligent people to put ideas into the minds and hearts of people, into everybody, that is contrary to that Christian worldview. Through social media, things like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and whatever else there is now. It's not called Twitter anymore, it's called X. Whatever else there is now, he's using that to put out things into the world and put out the way that people act towards the world that are both contrary to the Christian worldview. I think that perhaps you get the picture. Satan has always tried to spread seeds of doubt and seeds that are contrary to the Christian worldview into the lives of God's people. Sometimes we have a choice in this. Sometimes there's ways for us to work around that, but I'm going to tell you, I think that it is largely impossible to live your life today without being affected by and exposed to the evil works of Satan. So one of the areas that we need to have self-control is over our identity and over our convictions. Look what Daniel said. He moved on in verse 5. It says, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and the wine that he drank. And they were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them new names. Daniel, he called, I said this 50 times this morning, but, it's hard to say. Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So as the young men were chosen and gathered, we begin to see part of Nebuchadnezzar's plan unfold. And we notice a couple of things that he goes after here. First, he goes after their diet. Among the most rigid codes that the Israelite people lived by, it was their diet. There were foods that they could consume, foods that they couldn't consume, and there were ways in which they were supposed to eat them and ways in which they were not supposed to. They had very specific guidelines on the food and the way that it was prepared and consumed. And the diet of a pagan king would most certainly not align with what they were doing. They would eat things and eat them in ways that were against the convictions of these Israelite boys. And secondly, we see that Nebuchadnezzar gave them new names. This might not seem like that big of a deal to us where, we just kind of come up with names based off of whatever, usually whatever's popular. I think it has changed massively even since social media became a thing. We might have a name that is like a family name or something like that, but names during this time I think held more weight to them. They were something that they thought out more, and the name given often it was a blessing or a prayer, something that a parent would wish or dream of for their children, that this is what we hope will become of our child. Or it could be that their name might change based off of the current situation or scenario that they're going through. So this was a big deal that was happening. The names of these 4 Israelites, they were connected to the heart of Yahweh, connected to the heart of their God, but the names given to them, they all had their roots in pagan deities. To Daniel, which means God is my judge, he gave the name Belteshazzar, which means I am Baal's prince. To Hananiah, which means God has been gracious, he gave the name Shadrach, which means illuminated by the moon god. To Mishael, which means who is like God, who is like God? That's a phrase of worship. That's a phrase saying there is nobody like the God that I serve. He changed his name to Meshach, which means who is like Sheach, which was a Babylonian idol. And then to Azariah, which means the Lord has helped me, he gave the name Abednego, which means slave of Nebo, which was a Babylonian god. Nebuchadnezzar immediately goes into 2 things to test their amount of self-control. He goes after some convictions that they have, and he goes after their identity. And they have to decide whether they're going to cave to the cultural norm, whether they're going to cave in and just say, well, this is just how it is now. This is just where we live now. This is just what we're a part of now. So they have to decide, am I going to cave to the cultural norm? Am I going to compromise my deeply held convictions? Or am I going to let them tell me that I'm somebody that I'm not? They can decide who I am. Am I going to compromise who I am? You and I, we have to make the same decision today. we have to ask ourselves, am I going to have enough self-control in the face of these cultural norms, in the face of what we're living in right now? And man, some people would say we're walking in Babylon right now. I don't know that I would say that. I think Babylon was far more messed up than even the United States of America is. But some people would say we're walking in Babylon right now. And so we have to ask ourselves, am I going to have self-control in the face of what is the norm? Or are my convictions going to hold strong? Will I compromise? Will I have enough self-control that I will not let culture dictate who I am? Will I have self-control over my identity, or will I compromise? Well, we're going to see what the Israelites did, but I think that it also brings up another issue of self-control, and that is self-control over the flesh, self-control over our desires. Verse 8 says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." Daniel resolved. I love that phrase. Daniel resolved. Daniel, he made a firm commitment. He made a firm decision that I'm standing here and I'm not going to change it. No matter what they throw my way, no matter what comes my way, I'm not changing it. In the face of a legal mandate given to him by Nebuchadnezzar's official, he decided in his heart that no matter what the consequences, that he wasn't going to give in, that he wasn't going to compromise, that he was not going to cave, because these were his strongly held convictions that were given to him by God. God told him not to, so he wasn't going to. But he also denied his flesh. Don't you know that the prospect of a king's fine diet had to have been appealing? Like all the finest meats in the world, all the finest side dishes in the world, all the finest desserts in the world, all the best wines and drinks that they could ever want. It's all available at his disposal. It's all right there looking delicious. But Daniel resolved. Daniel made a decision. And I know that your flesh has desires that are contrary to the plan that God has laid out for humanity. The reason I know that is because my flesh has desires. It's true for me, and it's true for every person who's ever lived. The Bible says that we have been given the sinful nature of Adam. The first human who ever lived is handed down to us by our ancestor Adam. It takes a great deal of self-control to resist the flesh. Your flesh will tempt you with all sorts of things that promise fulfillment, whether it be sex or food or money or addiction or opportunity to express emotions in a negative way or whatever it may be. The flesh has these desires. The flesh has its own way that is often at odds with God's way. But we've been given power to resist that. Daniel resolved. And so can we. And then finally, what Daniel shows us is that we need self-control over our faith. Moves on in verse 9. It says, "And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has signed your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king." Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. By the way, this is Daniel's writing this, and I love right there that he uses their Israelite names. He's like, I know they're trying to tell us who we are, but we know who we are. This is who we are. And this is what Daniel said. "Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you. And deal with your servants according to what you see." So he's saying, hey, compare us. Test us. Compare us. See what happens. Daniel laid it on the line here. After he resolved and after he felt the conviction, he went to Nebuchadnezzar's servant and his men and requested that he get to participate, he and the other Israelites get to participate in a different diet, in a new diet. Let me just point out a couple things here. In verse 9, it said that Daniel had favor with the chief. This is an incredible move of God, that he worked on behalf of Daniel and on behalf of the Israelites, that they had favor even in the face of their enemies, even to those who wanted to harm them. They had favor. Look at this verse in Proverbs with me. It says, when a man's way pleases the Lord, he makes even his enemies be at peace with him. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. When we live self-controlled, resolved, God-pleasing lives, it opens us up to have fruitful relationships and dealings, even with those who are our enemies, even with those who are against us. But what I really want you to see is the way that Daniel put his faith on the line. He had to trust God. He had to trust God, knowing that what would happen to him and what would happen to this official if he were to appear weak before the king, knowing that it would not be good for them. And so he banked it all on God's provision. He banked it all on that God was going to take care of him because he was faithful. If Daniel was faithful, then God would be faithful. This is another one of those themes that carries itself throughout the book of Daniel. We see this with Daniel. He displayed a great amount of faith whenever he was told, if you pray, you're going to be thrown into the lion's den. We see this with the other three who they bet on their faith that God would take care of them, even if they didn't bow the knee to Nebuchadnezzar's statue and they had got thrown into the fiery furnace. There's an immense amount of self-control that has to be possessed when it comes to our faith, because our minds will tell us it's an impossible situation. Our hearts will tell us to give in to the fear and to let it control us. Our minds and our hearts will tell us, just play it safe. But sometimes the Lord is directing us to exercise faith, and we have to choose. Am I going to have self-control over faith and over fear? And when we do that, when we choose to have self-control over our faith and choose, we're going to do what God is asking us to do, even if I'm afraid right now, even if I can't see how this gets better in the end. When we do that, the Lord blesses us in that, and he blesses the process. Verse 14 says, so he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. They listened to God. They did what they felt convicted by God to do. And what happens? It turns out better. So good, in fact, that the official said, hey, the rest of you guys are going on this diet also. Daniel's faith in God not only showed in his obedience, it showed itself in the results. At the end of the trial run, the young men, they looked better. They were more impressive. God worked in and through their self-control, and he continued to do so for the remainder of their lives. Their faith, it worked with the mouths of the lion. When the mouths of the lions were shut up, hungry lions, suddenly they can't open their mouths to eat. It worked with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they walked out of the 7 times hotter furnace and not a single hair on their head was even singed. I know that sometimes exercising faith can be difficult. I know that sometimes the situation seems impossible, but if we will have self-control over these areas, God will work in incredible ways. And let me remind you that the Spirit of God actually grants us self-control over our faith. Let's see how the chapter ends. It says, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Ananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. The 4 Israelite boys, and when I say boys, I mean like teenagers. They were young at this time. Not as old as me, not as old as our college students. Teenagers. They continued to grow in learning and skill. They continued to gain wisdom and knowledge. And when the final exam came, they had the best scores. King Nebuchadnezzar was most impressed with them. And we've already recognized and pointed out that the control over these areas of our lives it leads to what God can do. It led to what God was doing. A self-controlled life leads to God's abundant provision. When we live with self-control, the Lord somehow just takes care of us. He just meets our needs before we even know we need them. When we deny what we think we need, when we deny what we think we want, when we deny what we think is the only path forward, God shows up. He remains faithful. But I want you to recognize something here. The king was not impressed with these 4 Israelite boys because of their knowledge of Israelite customs and history. That would not have gotten them a promotion. That would not have gotten them an A on the test. What they grew in, and what impressed King Nebuchadnezzar, was that they grew in the learning and the skill of the Chaldean wisdom. You know, I think what we often try to do is we try to hide ourselves and hide our families from the normative customs of our culture because that's the safe thing to do, right? That's what we should do. But maybe there is some value to gaining understanding about the world we live in. Now, I want you to hear what I'm saying, not what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we dive in and participate in a lot of things that we know we shouldn't. But I think hiding our heads in the sand about it is not always the best bet either. What happened here, the Israelite, their knowledge, their position, it gave them the opportunity to have influence over the king. It gave them the opportunity to have influence over the wise men, the magi of that day. The magi, you probably remember that phrase, they show up on the scene 600 years later at the birth of Christ, bringing with them gifts, bringing with them worship of the king. This Babylonian culture, who formerly they were Chaldean people, but then this infiltration that Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do, Daniel wrapped it around and infiltrated them instead. And now this elite group of men who give wise counsel to the king and who give wise counsel to the people and to the Chaldean literature and language, they're suddenly worshiping Yahweh. And it's because these Israelites, they had this influence because they were just willing to try to understand, not participate, but understand. Here's my point. It is possible to live in Babylon, but not live of Babylon, so that you might have a gospel influence over Babylon. That's all I'm saying. And so, how do we do that? Well, I'll tell you, it's going to require self-control to do it well. And I would say that in part it was Daniel's God-given self-control that allowed him to live in it for the long haul. Did you catch the last verse that he was there until King Cyrus? That means 70 more years Daniel was in this. He had to have had an incredible amount of self-control. He started there as a teenager, he grew into a young adult, and then into a middle-aged man, and eventually into an elderly man. There's no way that he does that without a healthy dose of self-control given to him by God, empowered to him by the Spirit. And so when I look back at this list of virtues that Paul gave us, I think that the list is on purpose, that self-control is the last one there. Because Paul says you'll have love, you'll have joy and peace and patience, you'll be kind, you'll be good, you'll be faithful and gentle. But you're going to need a little dose of self-control to go with that. You know, those first 8, I've heard every single one of them at a funeral. When I was at Locust Grove, I sat in the sound booth for tons of funerals. And I've heard people talk about how loving and patient and joyful. I've heard every one of those. I don't think I've ever heard anybody at a funeral say, well, he was full of self-control. And so when we look at the list, we're like, man, that doesn't seem quite as like spiritual as the others. But I think Paul is adding that because he says you're going to need this. You'll need self-control because sometimes you'll want to be angry. You won't want to be loving. Sometimes you won't want to be kind. You'll want to be mean. Sometimes you'll want to worry, not have faith. Sometimes you'll want to respond with hatred rather than with love. Sometimes you'll want to cause division and not peace. Sometimes you're going to want to be rough and tumble and not gentle. So I hope that you recognize that while self-control, it may not sound as spiritual as the other 8, it is practically needed, and it is so important for Christ followers. It is so important for us to have. It is so important for us to rely on the Spirit. And when we pray that the Lord blesses us with these other 8, we need to add that 9th also, because it's so important. In every day of your life, you're going to have opportunities to compromise or to have self-control. You'll have opportunities to either compromise your identity and compromise your convictions, or you'll have the opportunity to have self-control over your convictions and identity. You'll have opportunities to compromise and give into the desires of your humanity, into the desires of your flesh, or to have self-control over the desires of your humanity and flesh. You'll have opportunities to compromise and be filled with worry, fear, and anxiety, or you'll have opportunities to choose self-control over your faith. And where there is an abundance of compromise, there is a lack of self-control. But where there is an abundance of self-control, there's a lack of compromise. And so we pray, and we just have to decide, do I want to be a person who's always compromising, or do I want to be a person who has self-control? And so I'd just like to ask you this morning, the band's going to go ahead and make their way forward. And actually, I want to ask everybody else, just bow your heads, close your eyes. And I'm not doing this so I can do a please raise your hand if you're feeling this kind of thing. I'm doing this because I want you to just really focus as we wrap up this sermon series. I just want you to be able to really focus on what the Lord is doing in your heart right now. And so I just want to encourage you, because it's just you and your mind and your heart with your eyes closed right now. It's nobody else. It's just you. Just to be honest with yourself. That you're not answering these questions for me. You're answering them in your own heart and for yourself. Are you a self-controlled person? Do you have self-control over your conviction and your identity? Are you prone to separate your life as a disciple of Christ, your identity, from your life as a parent, or your life as a spouse, or your life as an employee, or as a manager, or a neighbor, or a friend? Do you have self-control over your convictions, the things that God has clearly put on your heart, clearly given you through the Word? Do you have self-control over your human desires? Do you often give in to those desires when you're tempted? Are you losing the battle to addiction? Are you losing the battle to emotional outbursts? Are you losing the battle to whatever your struggle is? And do you have self-control over your faith? When the Lord directs your steps to do something hard, do you let the fear of the unknown force you into making your own path? When you're faced with a difficult season, do you trust that the Lord is still near to you, or do you let anxiety rule you? This morning I've asked the band to play a couple of specific songs today because I just want to respond to what the Lord might be doing in our hearts, what I think the Lord has been doing in our hearts for the last 9 weeks of this series. The first song that they're going to sing is called No Longer Slaves. And in one accord, we're just going to sing together this truth that we're not slaves to fear, we're not slaves to sin, we're not slaves to the works of the flesh. We're children of God. We do not have to give in to the things that our flesh might often call us to give into, or that our fear might call us to give into. I love this verse that Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8. It says, "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." Because of the blood of Christ that bought us, and because of the Spirit that lives within us, we are actually conquerors. And so we're going to stand and we're going to worship and we're going to sing. We're just going to ask the Lord to work in our hearts. We're going to sing these words like we believe them, that I'm not a slave to the works of the flesh anymore. I got the Spirit living in me. I'm a child of God. These 9 values that we have just dissected the heck out of over the last 9 weeks, these are actually attainable for me because I'm a child of God. And if you find yourself this morning saying, I don't even know if I'm a child of God, well, I want to invite you to come find myself or come find Bree, either during this worship set or at the end of service, and we'd love to pray with you. Let's pray together.